Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It appears that Mercedes have figured out what is causing their lack of performance in a straight line, especially with DRS Open compared to Red Bull. Aston Martin are experiencing similar issues with the same rear suspension and gearbox that Mercedes have. That might be causing their problems, amid Mercedes admitting there are radical changes coming shortly, and these have been planned for some time, even long before the start of the Bahrain Grand Prix a couple of weeks ago. Very much intrigued your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. So all the teams are looking at changes. McLaren especially, I honestly think that the Aston Martin resurgence has made, well, McLaren and Alpine seriously consider why they haven't been able to achieve the same thing. McLaren have gone pretty balls to the wall. They partnered with Workday. McLaren have so many partners, it's outrageous. They announced that today. But also they have nicked 15 staff in the aero department from around the grid. Some from Red Bull, some from Ferrari, and some from Aston Martin. And this is what will happen. It happened to Mercedes for the last several years, where teams like Aston and especially Red Bull were signing Mercedes employees because, you know, those guys that won the World Championship for a few years in a row, if they can get paid more money for another team, a new challenge, new environment, you know, new team, new colleagues, often that will happen. So Red Bull have been able to build up their department very strongly with some help from former Mercedes people, and Aston Martin did the same thing. But now it's, you know, people don't want Mercedes guys anymore so much. They want the Red Bull guys, they want the Aston guys. So McLaren have come along, they've poached a few people, including Mariano Alpine, who a senior aerodynamicist at Aston Martin, who is now going to join at McLaren. So it does seem that McLaren are thinking, hang on a second, we can't let this stand. That we're just moving back every single Grand Prix, it seems at this point, or every single year, compared to what resurgence they were trying to implement. And Aston Martin have come along, done all the right things, and now delivered a highly successful car so far this year, and long may that continue for the competitiveness of the sport. But of course, it's going to take some time for this to actually take effect. The other part of it is the Ferrari, that they have brought some new people in. So Zimmerman apparently is now going to kind of replace Bonotto as leading the development of the car for the 2026 regulations and beyond. So some internal shuffling at Ferrari as well, and it seems like the floor is causing a lot of Ferrari's problems, losing about 0.6 of a second. And if they gains 6-7 tenths compared to last year's car, that all teams have done apart from, well, only Ferrari, will see in a second here, then they would still be kind of competing with Red Bull. But right now they are way off the pace of seeing the first couple of races, so they're kind of scrapping their concept. We talked about this a few days ago now, that Ferrari seem like they've decided that what they've currently got is not going to cut it in the longer term, and they're going to do away with their current design. The problem that they apparently have, though, is that they have a lot of upgrades planned and in the works, so they can't just abort mission like Mercedes have, because I think Mercedes were aware before the season began, we'll see here in a second, that their car wasn't really going to cut it. So they've been planning changes for a long time now, whereas Ferrari have only just realized, it seems, that this isn't going to work. So they're going to get rid of the bowl-shaped side pods that were such a, I mean, they look beautiful, let's be honest here, but they were introduced on the F175. They've been slightly kind of scaled back for this year's SF23, but, you know, still, they're going to get rid of those, it seems, to try and run the car at the correct height, and possibly new side pods in Imola. And there's going to be a lot of upgrades in Imola, because Mercedes are probably going to try and do the same thing. But Aston Martin have been the most competitive car to the Red Bull so far this season. And Mercedes realized quite a while ago now that is something in the front axle, the front suspension, that Red Bull and Aston Martin are doing to gain the advantages in the corners to prevent the porpoising in the traction zones, where they're just so good, these cars, that maybe Dan Fallows and Adrian, you have similar ideas on. Of course, Dan Fallows was working with Red Bull before he joined Aston not that long ago, which has caused a bit of controversy on that front as well. But Aston Martin, being a customer team of Mercedes, they purchased the gearbox and the rear suspension from Mercedes. So it's the same on the Merc as on the Aston Martin. So Mercedes have effectively narrowed down to say, okay, well, what they're doing to get an advantage on us is nothing to do with the gearbox or the rear suspension, it is elsewhere. However, the gearbox and the rear suspension may actually be providing a disadvantage to Aston Martin, and it might be the key reason why they're not where the Red Bull is. If they had a different rear suspension, if they are the Red Bull's rear suspension or something like it, which they would like to do, they might well be as competitive as Red Bull are, but they are forced, which is funny to think about, they're forced to use the Mercedes components. Well, they're not exactly forced, but they decide to, and therefore, you know, because they're a customer team, that's the relationship they presently have that they might well change over time. But yeah, Mercedes components bringing down a more competitive team than Mercedes. I wouldn't have expected to say that before. Now, of course, we saw that Aston Martin have been crushing the rankings in terms of race pace gained year by year. We see that Ferrari are just the same speed as last year. Aston Martin 3 seconds faster. Red Bull gained basically a second, as did most other teams, and you'd imagine Red Bull's incremental gains from now on will be smaller because their car is possibly, hopefully, maybe for the competitiveness, reaching the limit of its potential. But one of the key elements of its performance is its unmatched straight line speed, not just in terms of pure straight line speed, but especially with the DRS Open. There was an article that came out the other day explaining that it's the diffuser at the back of the car that's working so well at the rear of the Red Bull, so that when the DRS is open, the airflow is way more efficient back there than any other car. I think Haas actually, in terms of percentage gained with DRS, have an equal gain in performance to Red Bull, but Red Bull are the fastest car in the straights pretty much, and they gain the most from DRS. Mercedes gain so much less speed when their DRS is open compared to Red Bull, and it's a similar-ish story with Aston Martin, in addition to Aston's straight line speed just being poor compared to the Red Bull. And when we say diffuser, we're talking about this part on the underside of the rear of the car, but it seemed like Aston Martin were losing, and Alonso was pretty much identical on pure pace in the corners compared to the Red Bulls around Jeddah and even around Bahrain, but he was losing roughly half a second a lap on pure straight line speed performance, and that is where the Red Bull is still stronger than the Aston Martin, despite being pretty similar in some aspects of their cars. It seems to be the rear of the car and the diffuser that is causing some of these problems. Now, it turns out this is from the Mercedes parts that they buy. So Aston Martin has a less efficient diffuser because the Mercedes gearbox is bulkier. Aston cannot copy the RB18 design or the Red Bull design because it's purchased from the Mercedes. The gearbox and rear suspension are the same as used on the W14. This means there are differences, and because the gearbox is bulkier, it affects the airflow, makes the diffuser less effective, and therefore makes straight line speed reduced, and also reduces, I believe, the effectiveness of the DRS. Now, I think the W14, by going for the zero pod design, their plan was that, okay, we can afford to lose some performance in the diffuser because the zero pod concept is going to be so good. But it seems the gearbox they designed for the Mercedes concept, when you then apply that to another concept, actually can hold back Aston Martin, which it is, and also, you'd imagine, has similar negative effects on the Mercedes. So I do imagine that Mercedes saw this coming, right, and thought, okay, it's a bit of a trade-off here. Okay, in order to accommodate the zero pods, we're going to have a bulkier gearbox. That means reduced performance of the diffuser. That means less straight line speed. They have, in fairness, increased their straight line speed this season compared to last year by just making the car less draggy in general. But in terms of DRS advantage in performance, they still lose a lot, as do Aston Martin right now as well. So Mercedes, I imagine, have realized as a result of this, like, you know, the trade-off between the benefits they thought they would see from the zero pods and potentially the deficit of the rear of the car is not worth it. Even Hamilton was frustrated about how, you know, unstable the rear of the car is, and he really doesn't like that right now, and it's causing him to struggle in some of these qualifying sessions, having the confidence in the car. And you can see that it's the straight line deficit that has been a massive problem for Mercedes, and even for Ferrari compared to Red Bull last year. If you guys think Jeddah 2022, when Leclerc was trying to chase down Verstappen, but by the time Verstappen got past, like, there was no getting back past Verstappen once he was ahead because the straight line speed was too great. Same story last year in Canada. Sainz was trying to chase down Verstappen at the end of the race, but the straight line speed was just too great, and by the time the Red Bull is in front, there's usually no catching it, even if you've got DRS. It was the same story in Jeddah this year. When Verstappen overtook Russell, Russell had DRS on the main straight with the slipstream and basically gained nothing, and that's just Red Bull doing a phenomenal job, and it's Mercedes probably realizing, and Aston Martin, they're going to need to change the way the rear of their car is designed to actually compete on that pure performance, because Aston can be as quick in the corners as Red Bull, they just lose in the straights. So Aston Martin, it's kind of funny, is looking to fix this weakness somehow by bringing a new rear wing upgrade. So to either this upcoming weekend in Australia, or maybe more likely to Baku, they'll bring a new rear wing which will intend to increase their top speeds and kind of combat some of the issues they're having with the Mercedes parts. Can you believe it? The other piece of the puzzle I thought was interesting here was Mercedes admitting they knew, even prior to testing and the race in Bahrain, that their car wasn't going to cut it. And I wonder if this is related at all to what we saw the other day with certain Mercedes engineers being fired basically for making a serious mistake in the scale models they put in the wind tunnel. They, like, I don't know, they messed up the scale models or something, some amateur mistake that Mercedes made, and some people have paid with their employment for. And, you know, maybe they thought for some time with with the results from those models that the car was going to be great, and then they realized once they figured out the mistake that actually the car wasn't going to be so good, and therefore they've known before the season began that we even saw Ted Kravitz mention in Bahrain, right, that there was the rumor of a B plan or plan B for Mercedes that they were going to go for, and clearly they knew. I mean, even Andrew Chauvelin says here they knew several weeks prior to the arrival in Bahrain that they would need to change concepts significantly and take some serious departures. And, you know, this is probably a positive for Mercedes because Ferrari, it seems, have only figured out their issues very recently. Mercedes have known for some time. So, you know, they can prepare radical departures, as Chauvelin describes here, from their original concept because they've known for longer that it's just straight up not going to work. They know there's parts they want to change. There's urgency to do so. And he even goes on to say the W14 is an evolution of last year's car. So much of it is linked, but now we're looking at more substantial changes because it's evident this structure hasn't given us the performance that we want. That said, there are other elements of the car, not just the side pods, they want to improve. If they just chucked the RB19 side pods on the W14, it wouldn't make the car massively fast. The reality is the vast majority of the gap we have will have to be reduced by working on other areas of performance. We have a lot of projects underway to try and improve performance over the next 5 races. So quite the statement there from Chauvelin that over the next 5 races from now to, you know, mid-May sometime, that's where they're looking to gain all their performance, and maybe from some of the elements that we discussed in this video. And, well, hopefully for the competitiveness, but also for Mercedes, that Red Bull will slow down in their progress as well. Because Toto Wolff is like, look, their car's got to be closer to the upper limit of what their car can do, so their improvements will gradually get smaller, but still, they're going to have to be very small or non-existent for any team to want to challenge this season. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.